Okay, this is Richard White again. Today, rather than tying a particular kind of fly, I'm going to demonstrate a series of different techniques for adding weight to flies. This will be a first in a series. This one will all involve using wires or tape. I'll look at beads and other things after that. And in some sense, this is almost a historical way of looking at it, in that I'm going to start with the first technique I ever learned, which involved using a little bit of lead wire. And when you use lead wire, I mean, obviously some people don't want to use lead, in which case there are lots of good substitutes. The advantage of lead is it's very dense, it's incredibly soft, very easy to work with. But obviously it's toxic, so there are reasons to not use lead. I'll demonstrate the lead. You can use this same technique with many of the lead-free wires, but understand that those lead-free wires are much less dense than lead. And I will demonstrate something that I think is a far better alternative than most of the lead-free, so-called lead-free wires, which would be using copper wire. Now, so the first thing I'm going to do is, the first technique I learned involved tying the lead on either side of the shank, basically making a very flat shank. So like most cases for starting a fly, I'm going to lay down a base of thread. This is, in this case, it's largely to keep the wire from slipping. And I'm not going to go all the way back. And then I'm going to get a piece of lead wire that I've already pre-measured, and I'm going to lay it on one side of the shank. And the trick here is you want to keep it on the side of the shank. So it's a matter of getting it lined up where you want it. And I'm mostly going to use it for the thorax into the beginning of the abdomen. And I'm going to keep manipulating it so it sits on, in this case, on your side, the far side of the shank. Go past it so I can taper into it, because part of what you're going to be doing here is creating a taper. I have another piece of wire, same length. Basically, I folded one piece in half and cut it. It's a nice thing about these soft wires is you can cut them with a pair of old scissors. And now I'm just going to lash this to the opposite side of the shank. And I will keep adjusting it so that they sit on opposite sides rather than rolling underneath or on top. Again, taper them off. Use thread to create a taper towards the back. I'm not winding too tightly, because if you do, it's going to have a tendency to pull the lead around. Now once you've done that, you can add either, if I can turn it to the side, you can see it creates a slightly wider body, which, if you think about it, would be very typical for many mayflies. So one of the reasons to use this particular approach is that it would be very useful for imitating a clinging mayfly. Then you want to put some sort of a cement. In this case, I'm just going to use head cement here, just to lock all of this in place. And then I could go ahead and tie the rest of the fly, or I could tie a series of these and go back and dress them later. In this case, this is just about putting on the weight, so I'm just going to whip finish it, set this aside for later, and I could then finish a fly with that. Now, that approach of using lead on either side was the first technique anyone ever taught me. But what you see most of the time these days is that people will actually wrap the lead on the shank. Many ways it's far simpler. Now one of the approaches you use here is you want the diameter of the wire to be fairly similar to the diameter of the hook shank. It works for good balance that way. And then I'm just going to wrap a number of turns, and the number of turns is based on two things. It's going to create not just weight, but it's also going to help determine the proportions of the fly. And again, the nice thing about lead wire is it breaks off very easily. Most of the lead-free wires are very similar. You can use your fingernails to press that down. So the tag end goes in nicely. And in this case, I'm using it to build up just the thorax. Then I can use the thread, create a little dam in front. Holding the thread over the lead, I can then wrap and then go behind it, and that will lock it in place so it's not going to slide around. I can come back, smooth it out with a little more thread, create a bit more of a taper, and then I have the beginnings of the body shape for it could be a mayfly, a stonefly, almost doesn't matter. I could whip fin again. Now I've got a fair amount of weight on there. I could have used a little bit more lead to get a heavier fly. But again, a very simple technique. And in this case, you don't even need to use any glue or anything, any head cement or anything else to hold it in place. The thread does all the work for you. Very common technique. Gives you a nice shape on your fly, and it weights the fly nicely. Now, many people would then instead use some of the lead-free wires. As I said before, lead-free wire, as a rule, is much lower density, or what's sold as lead-free wire has much lower density than lead wire. It's about, the only sources I've been able to find say it's about 60% of the density. In which case it's not going to sink your fly as effectively unless you really bulk up the fly. What I prefer is to use copper wire. Now, copper wire has a density much closer to that of lead than do the so-called lead-free wires. Now, people like the lead-free wires because they're like lead, they're very soft, extremely easy to work with. But if you start working with copper wire to weight your flies, not only is it denser than anything else you're going to use other than lead, it's very simple to work with because you can have it on a spool. You can buy it on a spool. And it comes in a variety of thicknesses. So you can weight as much as you want. And by using a finer diameter, because it is very flexible, you can build up your entire profile of your fly just with the wire. Indeed, you can tie the entire fly using the copper wire as though it were thread, with a couple of caveats. So I can start this exactly the way I would if I were going to start tying with thread, and I can leave a long tail if I want, leave a very long stretch that I could then use to rib the fly. But right now all I'm going to be doing is building up the underbody. So same as if I were using thread. Once I wrap it over itself and start touching turns, moving back. Now, two things. If you're using copper on a bobbin, in your bobbin holder, you probably want to be using, you'll notice this particular bobbin holder is ceramic. It's much less likely to cut the wire. Also, the copper wire, when it starts twisting up, the way any thread does when you wrap, you can actually break it. So every so often you want to just stop, let it hang, let the twists come out. Otherwise you'll be turning it and it will just snap. It's quite strong once in place, but you need to be careful when you're winding it on to let it unwind every so often. So now I've done one layer going back. Now I can go forward, add another layer. But this time I won't go quite as far forward. And then I can come back over that again. But I won't go quite as far back. And then I can come forward. And using a technique like that, I can build up a profile of a fly just using the wire. Now, what I could have done instead is, had I brought this, well, I'll even demonstrate it. So I could just break that off and then build a fly over top of that with the usual kind of materials for pretty much any fly. But now, if I'm going to add another layer going back, and I could just turn this into a very standard fly. So I could grab some dubbing. What do I have here? I have some dubbing on my desk here. So I'll pull out a little dubbing. Now I won't need a lot of dubbing because I've already built up most of the shape of my fly. Now to dub on the copper wire, I just add a little bit of wax. And then I can add dubbing to it, same as I would to thread. And then I can dub the body. And draw that out a little bit more. And I could, I'll make a very simple fly here. I'll take a slightly darker color for the area around the head, make a very, very simple fly, but you can see how you can use this to make pretty much any type of fly you like. Again, I'll let it hang a bit to take any spin out of it. Then I can even whip finish with this. I don't want to whip finish yet because I left this out here so I could use it to create a rib. And I can bring the rib up and over. Just a few turns to create a head. Helicopter off the last piece. And then 3 turns are plenty when you're using the wire. And I have a nice little fly. I can, as I would anytime I'm using wire, I can helicopter that off. I can pick out the dubbing to create legs, make it a little buggier, and have a perfectly nice, simple little fly. Now you could have added the tail, could have added other, some sort of fiber for legs, but notice the copper wire makes a wonderful either just a base, or you can actually tie with it. Very simple, very fast technique. If you leave it a little sparser, some of the copper can show through. You get some color there. The copper wire comes in many colors because it's been coated. In this case, I'm using a fairly thin copper wire. I have several thicknesses. You can use, for most flies, I would be using a 32 gauge, American wire gauge, AWG 32, which is a fairly lightweight. It's probably similar to what you would call fine copper wire, but not extra fine. And then for larger, heavier flies, I would be using a 26 gauge. Notice in this case, I have bought them on large spools, because if you use any amount of it, it's a fraction of the cost to buy it in quarter-pound spools or half-pound spools rather than almost by the foot when you buy it at a fly tying shop. Normally I would say getting stuff from the fly tying shop, but if you're going to use copper wire to build up the fly, you will go through it at a furious rate, in which case the less expensive would be handy. Now, the other interesting technique would be you can use a much denser wire. For example, lead is a little bit over 11 grams for every cubic centimeter. as a unit for density. Water has a density of 1 gram per cubic centimeter. Now, copper is just under 9 grams per cubic centimeter, so it's very close to the density of lead. Now, you can buy, it is a little expensive, but you can buy tungsten wire. Now, tungsten wire is significantly denser than lead, so you don't need very much. The trick with tungsten wire is it's particularly stiff, so you want a very fine tungsten wire. And you can go online and find sources for tungsten wire. It's very stiff, and it will destroy scissors. You need really good wire cutters. I mean, it's harder to work with, but it is much denser. You can build up very little bulk and have flies that will sink beautifully. But the tungsten is definitely more expensive than the copper, and it is harder to work with. I have worked with it a little bit. I find it's really almost not, to me, it's not worth the trouble. Now, the other approach, rather than using wire to weight your flies, but as a similar idea, would involve using a lead tape. So I'm going to go to a different shape hook here. And when I use lead tape, and I put some on my desk here, and there it is, this lead tape comes in large rolls. I have cut it in half here, and it has a sticky back on it with protected by paper, and it's actually used normally for adding a little bit of weight to the head of a tennis racket. But it's really handy because since it's it is a tape, it sticks where you use it, and because it's flat as compared to round like a wire, you can layer it very effectively to build up a nice taper on your fly. So once I peel off the paper backing, I now have a sticky lead tape. I'm going to turn my hook a little bit just so I can see it a little better. I'm going to start fairly far back, and I'm just going to wind the tape onto the hook shank. Now, it's lead, so it is stretchable, so I can then come back over it, build up the body a little bit more, and I won't go quite all the way to the back, and I can come forward again, and I can do that until I'm happy with both the shape I've built and with what I think will be the weight of the fly. And the nice thing is it's soft enough you can use your fingernail to smooth this down and create a nice tapered body. This one's a little bit rough, but again, now I can smooth that out even more using my thread to finish the taper. Build it up in the front, come over, and I can actually use that to press down on any parts that stick up higher than I like. And in this case, create a very nice body on what would then become a caddisfly larva or caddisfly pupa. Again, just by using the lead tape on the body. Smooth that out as much as you like, with thread to smooth that taper, and then tie whatever dubbing or other material you're going to use over top of it. Since I'm just going to put this fly away for later, I'm just going to whip finish it, and I could make up a whole series of those and then go back and do all the finish work on the fly afterward. So notice when you're working with wires or tapes, you have several advantages, several different approaches you can use. Again, so laying it on either side of the shank, wrapping the wire, very dense wire around the shank just to give it, mostly to give it weight, using copper wire to build up the profile of the fly. And also you can even tie with the copper wire, or you could just build it for the weight and the profile, or using the lead tape. Again, the big advantage of lead is, the two big advantages are the density and the fact that it's the easiest stuff in the world to work with. Copper wire, to me, is the best compromise. It's not toxic. These are all coated copper wires because they're actually, if you wanted to buy them in large quantities, it sells them they're sold as magnet wire. This is what's used for electromagnets. The finer gauges are even used for winding pickups for electric guitars. Anyway, so any of these approaches are useful. Each has an advantage for different kinds of flies. So use whichever one, practice any and all of them, but use that. Try to figure out which one would work best for which application. Do you want the flat body? Do you want the body built up? Do you want, how dense would you like it? And thereby, how bulky would you like the fly? I hope that proves useful. My next video in this series will involve using beads. I'll deal with the beads most people are used to, the tungsten beads or the brass beads, but I do a lot with glass beads, which have some other real advantages. But for now, that's it today. I'll put a fly back in here as something to end with. And happy tying. Thank you. Bye-bye.